Now let me start by asking a question. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? What does it mean to follow him? When we think of this, we see in this passage that people are responding to this invitation to follow me. And when he calls people then to follow me, does that mean something distinctively different than what we might understand it to mean if someone were to say something similar today? I even thought about that when we talk in our culture about following someone. Usually it's referring to social media. And so you follow people on Twitter. And I looked up even out of curiosity, who has the most followers on Twitter. And it's the singer Katy Perry. She has nearly 108 million followers. And second is Justin Bieber with 105. And as much as you hear about President Trump and he tweets and he has many followers on Twitter, and he's actually has almost, or President Obama has nearly twice as many as him. President Obama is number 3 with more than 103, and President Obama or Trump only has about 55 million followers on Twitter. Well, that's a lot of people. But what's it mean to follow? I thought what if you go beyond like Twitter? That's really short. If you go to someone who has more content, and so I thought, well, let me see what they have on YouTube and followers, and the number one person in the world that has the most followers on YouTube is a Swedish guy named PewDiePie, and he's a video game commentator with 69 million subscribers. Now, I don't know what's more discouraging, that you have Katy Perry is the world's most followed person on Twitter, or a video game commentator who's the most followed person on YouTube. I mean, I'm not really sure, but let me ask, just as we kind of introduce this idea, that's when we talk about follow. That's what people often say. But was the disciples' decision to follow Jesus in any way at all similar to what it means to follow Katy Perry or PewDiePie? Another place we often talk about following is we talk about, well, I follow my favorite team, my favorite athlete, and so maybe you're a follower of the Cleveland Indians and you're a fan and you really get into the Indians, or maybe you love football and you're a fan of the Browns and you follow the Browns. And not that you need to dress up, but even if you are a fan of the Browns, maybe you're dressing up more like this, because there's not a whole lot to be, it's maybe more appropriate costume. And again, when we think of that, we follow certain things, but again, we have to realize that we use the terminology in this way. And in that day, when they talked about following somebody, it was radically different. And we see that in here. When he talks about it, Jesus calls people to follow, but he calls them to follow as disciples. And so look at verse 37. You see this repeatedly. The 2 disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. Verse 40, one of the 2 who heard Jesus speak and followed Jesus. Verse 43, Jesus challenges Philip, and he says, he found Philip and said, follow me. And so we have to ask, again, what does it mean to be a follower? It means to be a disciple. That's the term that is used throughout the Bible. Now, as we look into this, we're going to look at some of what the disciple meant then, but here's a really important point that we need to remember from the onset. And that is, the purpose of studying this passage isn't just to go back in history and to understand what it meant back then. For these 12 men who are often known as the 12 disciples, what it meant for them to become a disciple of Jesus. Now, what we have to realize is the key is when you look throughout the New Testament, everyone who was a follower of Jesus is called a disciple. That's what they all called themselves. Even after Jesus' death and resurrection, when you couldn't literally follow him in a physical way, what happened is that if you read through the book of Acts, what you find is the followers of Christ consistently referred to themselves as disciples. That's how they saw themselves. So when we understand the whole concept of discipleship, what we're doing is we're looking not only what it meant back then, but what it should mean for us today. What does it mean to follow Christ? What does it mean to be a disciple? So let's dive into this as we look at John 1. And what we're going to see is right from the beginning, it teaches us something about the essence of discipleship, of what it means to be a disciple. Now, we're starting our study in verse 35 of John 1. And in this case, though, we're kind of jumping into the middle of a story. If you were with us last week, we saw the first part of that. And that's John the Baptist who is introducing Jesus. And Jesus, John the Baptist, has talked about him, and then Jesus shows up. And in verse 29, we're told that, that the next day he saw Jesus coming, and he said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And he introduces him, and he said, this is the one I've been talking about. Now, if you have your Bibles now, look with me to verse 35, where we start here. And you see, it says right, the very next day, John again was standing with two of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked by, and he said, "Behold the Lamb of God." And so as he walks by, the very next day, Jesus repeats this proclamation, and in a sense, he's got two of his disciples right there, and he's looking at them and challenging them. And what we see is the reason he's challenging them is evident in the very next verse, verse 37. The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. And I think the weight of what he's saying is, yesterday when I said this, I'm not just making a theological statement that I want you to know and understand. I'm making a practical statement. This is who he is, and if that's true, if this is the Lamb of God, if this is the Messiah, if you've come to me and you're my disciple to learn about the one that's coming, and now the one that's coming, you should be following him. You should be acting on this. Again, when you think about discipleship, it's not just saying, okay, well, let's think about it, let's understand it, let's prepare ourselves. No, through this, if it's true, you act. And that means that you commit. So even when we think about with Jesus and his ministry, in the years of his ministry, there were crowds of people that surrounded him, that even followed him. And some were skeptics and would argue with him and really struggled to understand. Some were really seekers, and they didn't argue, but they didn't really believe, and they were trying to figure out who this Jesus was, what he was preaching. Yet some that were students, they wanted to come and learn. He was a great teacher. He was a great rabbi, and they wanted to understand his teaching. Yet some that were maybe more fans. They liked what he said. They liked the energy around him. They really liked what he did. They loved seeing the miracles. But then you had some that were disciples. And there's a difference between these. You see, the word disciple means to be a learner, but it means more than that. It means to be an apprentice. It means to be a follower. It's a term that was used to describe in that day a very specific kind of relationship between a student and a teacher, between a student and master. See, it wasn't just a student-teacher relationship where you would go to class for a couple hours and you would learn what they had to say, but it was a kind of relationship where literally you lived with that teacher. You not only heard his teaching, but you saw him live it out. And much of the teaching was they would teach the crowd, and then they would walk afterwards. What did you mean about that? And you would see these principles not only hear them taught, you would see them lived out. Now that explains these verses that we see in John. Because again, we saw in verse 37, they followed Jesus. Now we'll go to verse 38. They followed him, and Jesus turned and saw them following him, and he said, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come to me, or come and you'll see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him about a day, and it was the 10th hour. Now, when we look at this, it really does sound strange for this whole interaction. I'm going to follow you, and they go start to follow Jesus. Jesus said, "What are you looking for?" And their response is, "Well, tell us where you're staying." Well, let me make it personal. I mean, if we had somebody that came here and they visited and they talked to me afterwards and they said, "Boy, I visited your church, really love what you say. Boy, this is where I'd want to make my church home, and I think I could really grow here spiritually." And I'd say, "Boy, how can I help you grow spiritually?" And they say, "Well, show me where you live." And I'm like, man, that makes me feel uncomfortable. It makes my wife feel really uncomfortable. No, I don't want to show you where I live. That's what a strange request. And that's what they do. And it doesn't seem to fit. But it's totally understandable if you understand the whole idea of the relationship between a rabbi, a teacher, and a disciple. You see, the students would live with the rabbi. And what they're doing when they say, "What do you want?" And they say, "Show us where they live," they're basically saying, "We want to be your disciple. We want to live with you." It's basically a request, will you invite us into your life as a disciple where we're going to live with you, for the foreseeable future? And Jesus' response was, "Yes, I will accept you. You are now my disciple." We have that relationship. That's what's happening here. So again, it's not just a regular teacher-student relationship. It's something that is way deeper. It's not just about knowing what they know. It's about becoming who they are. Now again, we look at this and we say, well, okay, we can't be a disciple in that way. But the idea that we've got to understand is what it means to follow Christ is that kind of commitment. It's not just knowing about him. It's not just liking him. But it's committing ourselves to know who he is, to become like him. The Bible says that in Luke chapter 6. Look what Jesus, in describing not only them, but us. It's a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. What does it mean? For all of us, if we are to be a disciple, that means we become like him. Now, again, this isn't just describing what the relationship with the 12. All of the early disciples or followers were called disciples. And you see consistently in the Bible, when it describes what it means to be a follower of Christ, it's described in those terms of following him, of becoming like him. One example, Ephesians 5, look what Paul says. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Imitate him, know him, get to know him, be like him, walk like he walked, so that when people interact with us, we should look like Jesus Christ. You see, but that's radically different than just being a student or being a fan. And so when you see this, the disciples chose that term. God chose that term to call all of his followers disciples, not because he was just looking for a title. He's describing something about the nature of what it meant to be a true follower of Christ. It's way more than being a student. It's coming and saying, I'm putting myself under your leadership, under your care. I want to know what you want me to do. I not only want to know the right theology of your thoughts, I want you to know how to make decisions. And if I'm going to be like Christ, that means that when I look at decisions, when I look at moral questions, when I look at things in life, what I want to do is I want to ask, how would Jesus handle this issue? What are the principles that Jesus talks about? Jesus, if you were me, what would you do? Because that's what I want to do. And even beyond that, it's a commitment that is a commitment to yes before I know the answer. It's not like, well, Jesus, I want you as an advisor, and what do you say about this, and then I'll decide whether I agree or not. No, because you're my master, I'm going to ask, and even before you give me the answer, I want you to know that my response is going to be yes. Because that's what disciples do. You see, but that's so different than what we often think in terms of Christianity or what it means to be a follower. This is a radically different level. What it is, it's not just someone who seeks to learn. It's not just a fan. It's an all-encompassing identity. It's saying, I'm not just calling myself a Christian because I identify with a certain belief system or because I like Jesus or because I'm not something else or because I was, baptized or, catechized when I was little. No, it's a relationship with God through Jesus Christ that seeks to know him, that seeks to walk with him in every aspect of our life and let him invade every aspect of our life. Because we want to become like him. Because we want to know his heart. And so the key question we each have to ask is, it's not if you're a Christian, however the culture defines that. It's not if you're a student of Christ or if you are a fan and if you like him and if you agree. The key question is, are you a disciple of Christ? Have you surrendered your life to him as teacher and master? Are you letting him reshape your thoughts, your attitudes, your actions? Are you becoming more like Christ? Now, one of the things that will happen if we truly become a disciple, we embrace him as the center part of our life, and there's a natural response to that we see here as well, and that is that there's a natural excitement, a zeal about what we found. We naturally want to share it with other people. And again, you see this throughout the whole passage. In verses 36 and 37, John the Baptist brings his disciples to Jesus and shares that truth. Then one of those disciples, Andrew, tells his brother, Peter, or Simon Peter, in verses 41 and 42. Then Jesus finds Philip, and Philip right away goes and finds Nathanael in verse 45 and tells him. What we see is there's an evangelistic zeal. Now, I even look for another word than evangelism because we think of evangelism as just religious, and I think the concept here is more than just religious. You see, the fact is when we're really excited about anything, the fact is we have this kind of evangelistic zeal. We want to talk about it. We want to share about it. We're excited. And you see this, it's interesting if you have sports teams, and when, there's rare times that our teams are good, everybody is talking about it. We may not paint our faces as baseballs, but I'm wearing Indians garb, and I'm talking about how the Indians doing, and I'm excited. Because it's natural. I have a hobby, and I want to tell you about my hobby. Boy, this happened, and I find other people that are interested in that hobby, or I try to win you over to that hobby because I'm excited about it. We have good news we want to share because that's natural. It's natural for us to want to share and invite people in. And when you look at that, what we've got to realize is we go back to here in John 1, and you see it's not that just God is saying, okay, well, believe me, and now you have a commitment to evangelize and go share the gospel. And we've talked a lot about the Great Commission. That's vital. But if we really have been impacted by Jesus Christ, it's not necessarily a duty. It should be natural for us. I mean, whatever I'm most excited about, I want to talk. I want to talk about it. I want to share. If it's something that truly is life transformative, I want to let people know. And I find it interesting, people that are, we're on diets, and you have all these diet fads, and it's, South Beach and this and that and keto diet. And what happens? That's all word of mouth. You have somebody that says, I tried this and I lost weight. And so let me tell you, because, you might want to do this. If you're talking about diet, have you tried this? And what works, we're excited about. We want to talk about. And here we have the ultimate answer in life. And it's natural for us to want to talk about it. And you see that being played out with these early disciples. Man, I found the truth and I want to share it with other people, and that's natural. And not only that, it's not only natural, but what we've got to realize is that something that was true then and is true today is pretty much everybody who comes to Christ because other people have brought them. You generally just don't have people stumbling into church and saying, boy, my life is a mess and I need help. What you have is you have people that are going and saying, here, let me tell you about Christ. Let me share how God's working in my life. And it may just be an open door. And over time, in that open door, somebody says, well, tell me more about that. And see, very few people come to Christ unless they've been invited to come by a friend. And so that's true of most of us. Almost all of us were brought here by someone else. And likewise, it means that our family and friends, they're unlikely to ever get to Christ unless you or someone else in their life tells and shares and invites them. Now, one of the reasons that we're kind of afraid to do that is we're afraid that we will start to share and we get a question. And it's interesting, if you go down to verse 43, you see that happen here. When Philip goes and shares with Nathanael. In verse 43, he calls Philip, and verse 44, Philip was from Bethsaida, city of Andrew and Peter. And when Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets have wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said to him, come and see. Now, we're going to come back to this in a minute. But what I want you to see is you're saying it's a Messiah? Well, part of it is there's some prejudice against Nazareth, but part of it is saying if he's a Messiah, isn't the Messiah supposed to come out of Bethlehem? And that's part of the question here. How can you claim he's the Messiah because he's you got the wrong city? Now, again, here you have Philip, who's a brand new believer. He doesn't know all this stuff. He doesn't know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He doesn't know all the answers. But you know what his response is? Not, how dare you question me? Don't you know this is, No, he doesn't argue with them. He just says, come and see. I don't have all the answers. Well, come and see. Come and try it. Come experience. Come, let's talk about it. Let's study. And what we need to realize is that we're going to share this, and they're going to have people ask questions, and we're not going to know all the questions. Don't be afraid of that. Don't argue with the person. Don't, so you can ask, just a lot of times the response is, here's what God's doing. Well, here's a question. Well, come and see. I don't know. Let's come and let's find out together. And again, what you see here in many, many places, that's what God does. People will throw or problems in there, but that's just of saying, okay, how do we respond to keep that door open? Now, we're going to come back to that in a minute. But let's go back to John 1, and we see in verses 40 to 42 that there's a transformation of discipleship. Again, if you have your Bibles, follow with me to verse 40. One of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which means Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. And Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, son of John, and you shall be called Cephas, which means Peter. Now, this is actually a really funny scene. You got to think about it. Put yourself into the scene. Try to experience it. All right, Simon goes to meet this teacher that his brother has told him all about. Man, you got to see this guy as a Messiah. And they walk up to Jesus, and Andrew begins this introduction. Jesus, let me introduce you to my brother that I told you about. And Jesus just stops him right there and looks directly at Simon and said, I know you, you're Simon, son of John. But from now on, your name's Peter. And you look at that and you think, what an introduction. And what's Simon thinking? Who is this guy? I've just met this guy, and what right does he have to change my name? Who does he think he is? Now, it's amazing. It's really making an incredible statement that Jesus could change his name because Jesus changes the identity of who people are. He changes their character. What's really interesting is that John doesn't get into, it never says, well, let me explain why I'm naming you Peter. Let me tell you about what Peter means. Let me tell you about how, you're Peter, and on this rock I'm going to build my church, as it talks about in Matthew 6:16. A lot of commentaries that I've read gets into that. And it gives all this explanation, which is really interesting, but Jesus doesn't touch on any of that at all here. Because that's not the point. There's other places that makes the point. But the whole point here is that Jesus is simply saying, I have the authority to change your name. I'm changing your name because that's what I do. I give people different names. I give them different identities. Follow me, and I'm going to change who you are. Now, part of that is we need to understand the significance of changing a name. In that culture, a name was really important. People were named because that said something about their identity, about their destiny. And so you even think in the story of Jesus' birth, we're told that he'd be called Jesus because he saved his people from his sins. Jesus means God saves. He was called Emmanuel, which means God with us. That he was giving names that said who he was and what he came to do. That's something we take very seriously. When we talked about naming our kids, we were very careful. We didn't just choose names that we liked. We chose names that said something about who they were. And we'll tell our kids all the time. We'll interact with them, and we'll say, this is who you are. This is your name. Live up to the name. Live up to that identity. Some people, I could share some of the, some names don't have a very good meaning. And I would share that, but some of you might be named that name, and it's kind of like, by meaning of name, that's not a great meaning, but name your kid something that means something that has significance. We even laugh about how it seems interesting that this seems to be true. We name somebody or they live up or down to that name. I found that especially true with dogs. Have you ever noticed that you name a dog something and they seem to fit that name? I remember I had a sister who named their dog Boo Boo. Cute name, but it lived down to the name. It was a true Boo Boo. I remember one time it ate a wallet with everything inside the wallet. It ate glass Christmas ornaments and left all the markings for the next couple days. Our dog, we have a wonderful dog. Our dog now is Teddy. And it's a really cute dog, and it fits a name, true teddy bear. He is cute, he is playful, but he has all the courage of a teddy bear. This dog will run away from bugs. Literally, if you have an ant, it will run away. I had a hard time getting its picture because I took out my phone and it kept running away from me because it was afraid of my phone. He lives down to the name. I think my parents have a dog that, my dad says, it's really stupid and, can't potty train it. He says, I'm going to rename it Einstein, so maybe it will live up to the name and start to figure things out. And I'm saying, no, Dad, it's too late. You gave it a name, the character set, you can't change it. Now, the thing is, we can joke about that, but the good news is, when it comes to us in our life, our name isn't set. That God does change the name. That God does change it. And Jesus isn't saying, I don't like the sound of Simon. I like the sound better. I'm going to give you a name I like better. He looks at Peter and says, that's who you were. This is who you're going to be. I'm changing your name because I'm changing you from the inside out. I'm not looking at who you have been. I'm looking at who I can make you to be. And I'm naming you Peter. You're the rock. Now let's apply it today. What we've got to realize is that it's not just teaching us about what Jesus did then to Peter. It's teaching us about what he does for all of us, that he changes the name of all who come to him. Now, this is actually explicitly in Scripture. It was not here, but let me take you to another verse. Let me take you to Revelation chapter 2, where Jesus is speaking to the church. These are the words from Jesus himself. Revelation 2:7 and look, or 17, look what it says. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. I'm going to give you a new name. If you overcome, if you have the faith to overcome, if you walk with me, I'm going to change who you are. You have a new name. You have a new identity. It's the same idea that Paul talks about, not in terms of name, but a very familiar passage in 2 Corinthians. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. You're a new person. And his point is, believe it. Become who you are. You're not restricted. You're not, some people, you said, man, this is my past and where I messed up and my sins and my failures. That's not who you're bound by. You don't have to be who you've been in the past. You're not limited by your failures in the past. You've had people that have spoken things to you, have pointed out your failures. You've had parents that have told you you're stupid, you can never be anything, you can never amount to anything. That's what you were named. That's not what you are named. Jesus Christ has the power to change your name. He has the power to change your identity. And will you believe it? The question really in this is, will you live up to this new name? Will you understand it? Will you become whom God has called you to be? Will you live as a new creation? And all that means. As we continue, what we see is that, he says even more about how we become a disciple. And look at verse 43. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, follow me. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him whom Moses in the law and the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. And Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said to him, come and see. Now, we looked at this a moment ago. And I love, again, Philip's response. It isn't to argue, it just is come and see. But it also shows us something about an inquisitiveness that Jesus calls us to in the process of becoming a disciple. You see, Nathanael challenged Philip, regarding these claims. And again, Philip didn't try to argue. And what we need to realize is that we're going to interact with people that are going to disagree, that are going to struggle. You might be here today and you say, I question this. I don't believe all this. And what I want you to realize is that we're not going to argue with you. The more that I've studied the example of Jesus' teaching, the more that I've seen that he doesn't argue. He just says, okay, let me ask you another question. Let me give you an invitation. Here it's really saying, are you willing to come and see? See, when I argue with someone, what I'm doing is that I'm arguing with them and they're not listening to what I'm saying. They're just trying to respond to my argument. If I ask them a question, sometimes they might actually be open to looking at the point that I think that they need to hear. And so it could be a question. One question that I've dealt with numerous times as I've dealt with, or asked numerous times as I've dealt with people that have been skeptics that wanted to argue. I'd say, let me ask you, I know that you don't believe this. I know that you struggle with it. How much time have you actually spent studying or researching the claims that you so readily reject as false? I'm not asking you how much time have you spent reading other people who reject it, because some of these people that reject it and tell you all the reasons why Christianity are false, they've never studied it. They don't know anything about Christianity. And for you to, I want to give credit, and if you reject it, that's fine. But if you reject it out of ignorance, basically out of what you've heard or prejudice, or Nathanael, what good can come out of Nazareth? I have preconceived ideas. If you've done that out of ignorance, the fact is I can't give you a whole lot of credibility for rejecting claims that you've never really looked at. You're arguing maybe against a straw man that someone else gave you about Christianity that's not really Christianity. How much time have you spent reading the Bible? How much time have you spent reading people that actually seem to defend and talk about the truthfulness of Christianity's claims? If you want, there's some great books. If you're here and you want these books, I'll be glad to share them with you. Books like Case for Christ, where he's a skeptic and he, went out to disprove Christianity and was led to Christ by it. You have Cold Case Christianity, again, a very similar book, but it's saying, okay, let's look at the facts, the evidence. Some people, I can't believe that God is a creator. Okay, well, there's a great book, Case for a Creator. If you look at this, look into it. And even if they say, well, I want to debate, you could tell them, I can try to do this. If you really want to know, there are other people who can give you better answers than I will. I mean, I would bring them to me. I'd love to talk with them. And, say, come to our pastor, come. If you talk to him, if you really want to know, if you're just arguing to argue, then you don't really want to know. But if you really want to know, and if you're willing to look at it, and if you come and walk away and say, I don't believe it, I can respect that. But it's hard for me to respect someone who rejects what they've never really looked at. And so we're going to say, come and see. Are you willing to come and see? Now, the last point, let's do it really quickly. It's the foundation of discipleship. And this is one that's kind of, when you first read it, it's a little hard to get. Verse 47, Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, behold, an Israelite indeed, whom there is no deceit. Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? And Jesus answered, before Philip called you, when you're under the fig tree, I saw you. And when he says that, there's no deceit, he's basically saying, here's someone that tells it like it is. And Nathanael right away gets that and says, I just was talking about this guy from Nazareth, and nothing good comes from Nazareth. And he just told what he said. He just was without guile. He just told it what it was. And he's kind of wondering, man, that's an interesting thing for him to pull out of the blue and to say that about me. And he says, well, how do you know that about me? And Jesus basically says, well, I knew you were under the fig tree. Where you said that thing about nothing good from Nazareth, I saw you there. And suddenly he realizes, oh man, I'm caught. I'm exposed. And he says, oh, surely you're the Son of God. Rabbi, surely you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. And Jesus answered him, because I said to you, I saw you under a fig tree, you do believe? You'll see greater things than these. Now here's verse 51. And he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now we look at that and we said, we have no idea what that's talking about, this really weird picture. But Nathanael got it. It was actually a very clear reference to Genesis 28. In Genesis 28, verse 12, you have Jacob having this dream. And he has this dream where, well, let me go and read it. He dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Now, here's the angels of heaven going on this ladder. Now, go back to verse 51, and what does it say? Heavens are open, and the angels of God are ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Hear what he's saying? You want to know about what that meaning was? Well, here's what it means. That I am the connection between heaven and earth. That I am the one that's going to connect, and that people are going to somehow to be able to connect to God through me. I am the ladder. I am the one that opens up heaven. I am the one by whom you can know God. I am the only one by whom you can have a relationship with God. Jacob said, this place is Bethel, the house of God. And Jesus is saying, I am Bethel. I am the house of God. I am God dwelling here in human flesh. And if you're looking at it, you're saying, well, how do we ever get to God? That's religion. How do we get to God? No, it's not how you climb up to God. You're never going to get there. You realize the only way to get to God is to come to the one who's the ladder, the one that's the connection. If you want to be a disciple, if you want to be a follower of God, if you want to be one who becomes more like God, we can only get there through Jesus Christ. That's the only way to have this relationship with God. 3 closing questions, and then we're going to take communion. Number 1, do you follow Christ as a student, as a fan, or as a disciple? What kind of relationship with you have? It's not just, okay, I'm a Christian and I'm going to go to church. Are you a disciple? Are you a true follower of him? There might be some that are skeptics, and if you're a skeptic, is your response to Jesus driven by prejudice, by assumptions, or firsthand evaluation? And are you willing to look? And if you're willing to look, I'm glad to meet you there and to help you through that process. And I would respect the process even if you walk away. But are you willing to come and see? The last question, if you're a disciple of Christ, he's given you a new name. You may not totally understand that name, but are you living down to the old name, or are you living up to your new name? It should be living up. I've got to change that in the notes. Are you living up to your new name? Are you living up to it? Are you being whom God has called you to be? He calls us to this relationship through Jesus Christ, what Jesus Christ has done on the cross. He's the ladder. We have a chance to celebrate that even now. In closing with communion, and recognizing it's only our faith in what Jesus Christ has done that any of this makes any sense. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions about what we talked about, Jesus Christ, our church, or anything else, connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or by email. We'd love to hear from you.